It was the night before Halloween in Coral Gables, Florida, a place where luxury met silence, and every mansion seemed to hide a secret. The air was heavy, the streets still. In one of those grand homes, an alarm began to scream into the darkness. It wasn't a prank, nor a false trigger. It was the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt an entire family for decades. When the police arrived, the scene that greeted them was something no human heart could truly be ready for. Inside the Millionaires' home, horror had taken form. A woman lay motionless on the cold kitchen floor. The walls told a story written not with words, but with fear, the kind that only greed and betrayal could summon. It wasn't just a crime, it was a message. That night, a tragedy unfolded that would test every line between justice, love, and money. The house that once symbolized success became the stage for the darkest of human instincts. Beneath the polished marble floors and the crystal chandeliers, something rotten had been growing. Resentment, jealousy, and the kind of quiet rage that can destroy everything. But this wasn't the story of a faceless tragedy. It was the story of Maggie Lucasio, a woman who believed in love, in family, in a life built from nothing to everything, until the very people she trusted most became her undoing. What happened inside that house would shock not only her son, but also the entire state of Florida. They say Halloween is when the line between the living and the dead grows thin. On October 30th, 2001, that line vanished completely inside one of Coral Gables' most expensive homes. And when daylight came, the question that echoed across Miami was simple yet terrifying. Who killed Maggie Lucasio, and why? To everyone who knew them, Edward and Maggie Lucasio were the image of success. They had the kind of life people in Miami dreamed of. A large house surrounded by palm trees, luxury cars, and weekends spent at charity galas. Yet, behind the closed doors of their Coral Gables mansion, that perfect picture was slowly crumbling. Maggie had come to the United States from Cuba as a young woman with big dreams. She met Edward while studying accounting at the University of Miami. He was charming, ambitious, and seemed to have a plan for everything. They fell in love quickly, married soon after graduation, and built their careers together. For years, it seemed like the perfect partnership, until ambition began to poison the heart of their home. Edward's firm handled the finances of Miami's elite, politicians, real estate moguls, and celebrities. He became known as a man who could make money grow in silence. But with that success came distance. The once warm husband became cold, focused only on expanding his empire. Maggie, who had given up her own career to raise their son, Eddie Jr., started to feel invisible. As the years passed, what had once been admiration turned into resentment. Rumors of Edward's affairs reached Maggie's ears. Nights of silence replaced laughter at the dinner table. When she confronted him, the arguments were sharp, filled with words that left scars no one could see. Still, Maggie tried to hold the family together, for her son, and for the dream she had built with her own hands. But every dream has its breaking point, when Edward's lies could no longer be hidden. Both in love and in money, Maggie filed for divorce. It wasn't just a separation of hearts, but of millions. The case was messy, painful, and full of secrets neither wanted the world to know. She also tried to obtain a restraining order after years of threats and fear. By late 2001, the court date was set. The next morning, Maggie would finally face her husband in front of a judge. She was ready to reveal everything she knew about his hidden accounts, about his betrayal, about the truth that could cost him his fortune. But Maggie would never make it to that courtroom, because on the night before Halloween, her story was stolen from her, inside the very home that once promised her safety and love. It was late evening, October 30th, 2001, a calm night in Coral Gables, just hours before Halloween. The streets were empty, the sky unusually still. Inside the luxurious neighborhood, one house stood in eerie silence until a sudden alarm shattered the calm. Neighbors would later recall the sound, shrill, desperate, echoing through the quiet streets. The kind of sound that freezes your blood before you even know why. Police were dispatched immediately. When the first patrol car pulled up, the garage door of the Lucasio mansion was open, Maggie's car still inside. The lights in the kitchen flickered faintly through the window. Officers entered cautiously, guns drawn. What they found inside would haunt them forever. Maggie lay on the kitchen floor. The room showed signs of a violent struggle. Drawers pulled open, a chair overturned, traces of chaos everywhere. It was clear she had fought for her life. Investigators believed she was attacked as soon as she stepped out of her car. She had tried to escape inside the house, leaving a trail of panic behind her. But whoever came for her knew exactly when she would arrive and exactly how to corner her. The brutality was unlike anything Coral Gables had seen before. There was no sign of forced entry, no stolen valuables, no random break-in. This was personal. The crime scene told a story of rage, the kind that doesn't come from strangers, but from people who once claimed to love you. Police soon reached Edward Lucasio. They didn't tell him the truth at first. They simply said that the alarm at his former home had gone off and asked him to come by. Minutes later, he arrived. Calm. Too calm. He parked his car, walked toward the flashing lights, and asked no questions. Not about his wife, not about why the house was surrounded by police tape. Officers noted his detached expression. No confusion, no shock, not even curiosity. When they took him to the station for questioning, Edward explained that he and Maggie had been separated for months. Their divorce hearing was scheduled for the very next morning. He claimed he hadn't seen her, hadn't called her, hadn't cared to. When they finally told him that Maggie was dead, he didn't cry. He didn't even blink. "I see," was all he said. At the same time, in another room of the police station, their 19-year-old son, Eddie Jr., was being questioned. He said he had spent the evening in the library, an alibi that was quickly confirmed. When he walked out and saw his father in the hallway, he stopped. Their eyes met for a brief moment that seemed to last an eternity. Later, Eddie would tell reporters, "In that instant, I knew. He killed her." I could see it in his face, no sadness, no fear, no regret. But what Eddie didn't know was that the truth was far more complicated than a son's instinct. Because in the days that followed, another name would emerge from the shadows. A name that would twist this tragedy into a web of betrayal unlike anything investigators had ever seen. The morning after the murder, Coral Gables awoke to a headline that seemed torn from a thriller. "Millionaire's wife found dead in luxury home." But behind the sensational words lay a mystery that refused to fit any easy explanation. The husband had an alibi. The son was innocent. And yet, someone had carried out an act of staggering brutality. Detectives combed through every inch of the mansion. Nothing had been stolen. Jewelry remained untouched. Cash sat openly on a table. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It was something far more intimate. Whoever had done this knew Maggie's routine and had been waiting. When police reviewed the surveillance tapes from Edward's beachfront apartment, they confirmed he had been home the night of the crime. That detail should have cleared him, but it didn't. Too many things still pointed in his direction. The bitter divorce, the hidden money, the anger. Even without a knife in his hand, Edward had every reason to want Maggie gone. Then a small but crucial lead appeared. A patrol officer remembered seeing a white pickup truck speeding away from Maggie's neighborhood that night. The driver had committed a traffic violation, but in the chaos of responding to the alarm, the officer hadn't stopped him. Days later, he reported it, a detail that would soon blow the case wide open. Investigators began asking questions. Did Edward know anyone who drove a white truck? He said no. But someone did. 2 days after the murder, a neighbor called the police. Between his fence and Maggie's, he had found a small sports bag, wet from dew, half hidden in the grass. Inside was a nightmare. Blood-stained clothes, a knife, and Maggie's missing credit cards. Forensics worked fast. DNA tests were ordered, fingerprints checked, fibers compared. Then, just as the investigation seemed ready to stall, Edward called the police himself. His office, he claimed, had been broken into. Strangely, nothing was missing, only papers scattered across the floor, as if someone wanted to give the illusion of a robbery. Detectives grew more certain. This man was either the unluckiest widower in Florida or the most calculating. They began talking to his employees, quietly asking about his life, his temper, his family. One name kept coming up, Michael Lucasio, Edward's younger brother. Michael was everything Edward was not, jobless, volatile, and addicted to the wrong things. He lived hundreds of miles away in North Carolina and owned a white pickup truck. When investigators found it, the interior was freshly reupholstered. Underneath the new fabric, they discovered telltale traces, remnants that even bleach couldn't erase. DNA testing confirmed what they feared. The gloves in the sports bag carried Michael's genetic material. Within days, police arrested him for the murder of his sister-in-law. The story spread quickly. The millionaire's brother accused of killing his wife. But those who knew the family whispered something darker, that Michael wasn't the mastermind at all. He was a pawn, a desperate man doing a wealthy brother's dirty work. For Maggie's son, Eddie Jr., that explanation was the only one that made sense. "My uncle didn't even know my mother well," he told detectives. "He wouldn't travel all that way to kill her unless someone paid him to." And with that single statement, the case took a sharp turn. The spotlight shifted once again, back to Edward Lucasio, the man who stood to lose everything if his wife had lived to testify the next morning. When the first trial began, the courtroom was filled with reporters, lawyers, and silent tension. On one side sat Michael Lucasio, disheveled, expressionless, his hands trembling slightly as the charges were read. On the other side, his wealthy brother Edward watched from a distance, calm as ever, wearing the same emotionless masks that had unsettled detectives from day one. The evidence against Michael was undeniable. His DNA was on the gloves, his fingerprints on the knife handle, and traces of Maggie's blood had been found deep within his truck's upholstery. But one question lingered like smoke. Why would he do it? The prosecution painted Michael as the hired hand in a family conspiracy, a desperate man killing for money. The defense countered, claiming he was an unstable addict, prone to delusions and violence, who acted alone under the influence of drugs. But through every testimony, through every photograph, one face kept returning to everyone's mind: the face of Edward, the husband, the one with everything to gain. After weeks of arguments and evidence, the jury deliberated for only 6 hours. Michael Lucasio was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Yet, even as the sentence was read, he refused to say a word against his brother. No confession, no bargain, no accusation, just silence. For many, the case seemed closed, but for Maggie's son, it was far from over. Eddie Jr., now a young medical student at the University of Miami, couldn't accept the verdict. He had spent his teenage years trapped between fear and fury, watching his mother suffer and his father manipulate everything around him. He was convinced that Michael was only the weapon, not the hand that had guided it. While studying medicine, Eddie began to study something else: his father's financial records. With quiet determination, he uncovered hidden accounts, transfers to offshore banks, and assets totaling more than $6 million. Maggie had discovered those secrets just before her death and had planned to reveal them in court the next morning. Her timing was fatal. The pieces began to fit. Edward had the motive: millions in wealth and a reputation to protect. He had the opportunity. He knew his wife's schedule, and he had the connection. A brother desperate enough to do anything for money. 4 years passed before prosecutors felt confident enough to try again. In November 2005, Edward Lucasio was finally arrested and charged with orchestrating his wife's murder. For Eddie Jr., it was the moment he had been waiting for: the chance to prove that his mother's death was not a random act of violence, but a planned betrayal. But this time, the trial was different. There was no DNA tying Edward directly to the crime, no confession, no witness who had seen him give the order. The entire case rested on motive, psychology, and the haunting pattern of phone calls between the two brothers. Dozens of calls made in the weeks before the murder, when the men had barely spoken for years. Prosecutors argued that Edward had manipulated his brother, offering promises of money and protection. They called witnesses: his secretary, who claimed to have overheard disturbing conversations; his former lover, who testified that Edward had hinted at something terrible before it happened; and his own son, who spoke about years of fear and abuse behind the walls of their mansion. Edward's defense fought back viciously. They painted him as a devoted husband, falsely accused by a bitter son. They pointed to his successful career, his charity work, his apparent calm as proof of innocence. They even suggested that the young Eddie Jr. himself might have had motives: revenge, or perhaps a hunger for control over the family fortune. The trial became a battlefield of emotions: father against son, truth against perception. And in the middle stood the memory of Maggie, a woman whose voice had been silenced, but whose story refused to die. After days of deliberation, the jury reached its decision. The verdict was clear: Edward Lucasio, guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Eddie Jr. sat motionless, then slowly lowered his head, whispering a single word: justice. But justice, like truth, never comes without scars. When the sentence was read, the room exhaled all at once, a collective sigh of 6 long years of tension finally breaking. Edward Lucasio, once a respected accountant for Miami's elite, now stood motionless as the judge declared he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. No possibility of parole, no second chance. For a man who had spent his entire life in control of numbers, power, and image, this was the one equation he could not balance. Eddie Jr. sat in the front row beside his grandmother. The weight of everything, the trials, the testimonies, the nights spent reliving his mother's final moments, pressed on his chest. When the gavel fell, he didn't cheer. He didn't cry. He simply whispered, "She can rest now." Reporters called it the case of the Millionaire brothers. But for Eddie, it was never about headlines or revenge. It was about truth. The truth that had been buried beneath greed and lies, hidden behind marble walls and smiles for the cameras. Months after the verdict, Edward granted an interview from his prison cell. His voice was calm, almost eerily so. "I didn't kill Maggie," he said. "I didn't ask my brother to do it. I loved her. I wanted her back." Then he made one final accusation, one that shocked even those who thought the case had no more surprises. He claimed his own son, Eddie Jr., was the real killer, that the boy, impatient for inheritance and blinded by anger, had orchestrated everything to make his father pay. The statement drew headlines, but few believed him. Not the investigators, not the jury, not the public, and certainly not the young man who had spent half his life fighting to bring him to justice. Eddie Jr. called it the last lie of a man who couldn't face his own reflection. In August 2018, 17 years after the night that destroyed his family, Edward Lucasio died in a prison hospital at the age of 67. No one from his family attended the funeral. His ashes were claimed by no one. The house in Coral Gables, once a symbol of success and tragedy, was sold for $3 million. Its walls cleaned, its floors polished, its history unspoken. Today, that same house belongs to a new family. Children laugh in the garden, where police once marked evidence. The neighbors say they've never heard a sound from inside at night. No echoes of the past. Only silence. As for Eddie Jr., he became a doctor, dedicating his life to healing others. Perhaps because he knew better than anyone that some wounds never fully close. In interviews, when asked about forgiveness, he only says, "My mother taught me that kindness saves more lives than revenge ever will." And maybe that's the final legacy of this story. Not the horror, not the greed, not the lies, but the proof that even after the darkest night, there are still people who choose light. Because justice doesn't always wear a badge or a robe. Sometimes it simply lives on in the heart of someone who refuses to give up. The house of horror is gone, but the silence it left behind still whispers one eternal truth. Love, once betrayed by greed, can destroy a family. But love, reborn through courage, can heal what even justice cannot.